Let me start with a quick question. What do you do when you've done everything you know how to do and it still doesn't work? You prayed, you tried, you worked hard, you gave it your best effort. But at the end of the day, it still feels like you came up empty. If you've ever felt like that, then you understand exactly how a fisherman named Simon, the man we later know as Simon Peter, felt in Luke chapter 5. Simon was not a beginner. He was a professional fisherman. Fishing was his job, his livelihood, his expertise. The Bible tells us that Simon and the other fishermen had been fishing all night, casting the nets, pulling them back in, trying again. And every time those nets came back into the boat, they were empty. Imagine that morning, the exhaustion that they had. Imagine the frustration because they didn't catch anything. They're washing their nets now, which means the workday is over. They're done. They're heading home. But that's when Jesus steps into Simon's boat. Jesus teaches the crowd for a while. When he finishes, he looks at Simon and says something that must have sounded very strange. In Luke 5:4 it says, "Now when he had left speaking, he said unto Simon, Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a draught." In other words, Jesus was saying, Simon, go deeper, go deeper. And that's the message I want to share for a few minutes today. Sometimes your faith has to go deeper before you see the miracle. Now think about Simon's situation. Jesus was asking him to go back out into the water after he'd already worked all night. Not only that, fishermen in that time usually caught fish at night, closer to the shore. Jesus was telling him to go into the deep water during the daytime. From a human perspective, it didn't make sense. Simon knew fishing. He could have easily said, Jesus, I respect you, but this is my field. I know how fishing works. Instead, Simon says something powerful. In Luke 5:5, he says, Master, we have toiled all the night and have taken nothing. Nevertheless, at thy word, I will let down the net. That word, nevertheless, is the language of faith. Simon is basically saying, it doesn't make sense. I'm tired. I'm exhausted. I've already tried. But because you said it, I'll do it. That's what real faith looks like. Faith isn't trusting when everything makes sense. It's not trusting God when everything makes sense. Faith is trusting God when it doesn't make sense. Maybe you've experienced moments like that in your life. Maybe you've tried something and it didn't work. Maybe you believed for something and it didn't happen the way that you thought it would. Maybe you worked really hard and still felt like you were coming up empty. After a while, you start thinking, maybe I should just stop trying. That is exactly the moment when Jesus sometimes says, launch out into the deep. Go deeper in your trust. Go deeper in your obedience. Go deeper in your faith. Because the miracle isn't usually waiting in the shallow places. It's waiting in the deep. Watch what happens when Simon obeys. In Luke 5:6, it says, and when they had this done, they enclosed a great multitude of fishes, and their net brake. The nets were so full, they started breaking. The boat started filling with fish. They had to call another boat to come help. Think about that. The same water that seemed empty all night long was suddenly overflowing. The miracle was already in the water. Simon had to go deeper to find it. He had to go deeper to find it. Sometimes in life, the only thing standing between you and what God wants to do in your life is the depth of your faith. Some people believe just enough to stay comfortable. Deep faith says, I'm going to trust God even when I'm tired. I'm going to trust God even when I don't understand. I'm going to trust God even when it didn't work before. Here's something important. The fish were not the greatest miracle in this story. The real miracle was Simon's life being changed. Because a few years later, Jesus tells him something powerful. A few verses later, I said years, a few verses later, he says something very powerful. Jesus says, fear not, from henceforth thou shalt catch men. Jesus was saying, Simon, this moment isn't just about fish. I'm calling you into a purpose. And that's how God works. Sometimes what looks like a simple moment of obedience is actually the doorway into your calling. Wherever you are watching from today, maybe you feel like Simon felt that morning. You've worked hard, you've tried, and it feels like your nets are empty. Maybe Jesus is saying the same thing to you today that he said to Simon. Launch out into the deep. Go deeper in prayer. Go deeper in faith. Go deeper in trusting him. Because a place that feels uncomfortable might be the very place where your breakthrough is waiting. And the moment you say, nevertheless, at your word, Lord, you may discover that what looked empty was actually full all along. Before I finish, let me leave you with this question. What is the deep that God is asking you to step into right now? What is your deep? For some people, it's trusting God again after disappointment. For some, it's stepping out in faith when it feels risky. For others, it's simply obeying God in something you already know he told you to do. Simon didn't see the miracle until he launched into the deep. Sometimes the difference between an empty net and a full net is one step of obedience. So if this message spoke to you today, I want you to do something simple. I want you to type the word deep in the comments. Not for me, but as a reminder to yourself that I'm willing to trust God deeper. And if you know someone who needs encouragement today, please share this message with them. Because the miracle might not be in the shallow water. It might be waiting in the deep. Wishing everyone a very blessed day today. Goodbye.